GCLA TV.
Welcome to GCLA TV, where we bring you the brightest minds to tackle the toughest issues relevant to the luxury transportation marketplace in the here and now. I'm your host, Sara Eastwood Richardson, Executive Director of the Greater California Livery Association. Our guest today is Neil Hammond, partner at Goldspring Consulting. Neil has spent 15 years in the travel industry as a buyer and consultant. Neil started his career with Schlumberger and has worked in the United Kingdom, France, and the United States while traveling extensively during his career. As the global travel manager for Schlumberger, Neil implemented the $360 million travel program in 40 countries. After leaving the company, Neil joined Avito as director, leading a team of professional consultants engaged in air and hotel sourcing projects to corporate events. After leaving Schlumberger, Neil joined Avito as director, leading a team of professional consultants engaged in air and hotel sourcing projects to corporate clients. Welcome, Neil Hammond.
Thank you very much, Sara.
So let's jump right in here. We're part of the mobile community, as you know, and no matter what we do to sanitize our fleets and to prepare for the industry comeback, we're frankly at the mercy of mobility. People have to start moving again. Shed some light on what's going on that we're not hearing about.
I'm not sure that there's, let's say, an overall global strategy for governments. Obviously, they want to get back as soon as possible. But different countries have got different strategies, or there's not one strategy. Even in the US here, we'll see that, whilst there's been some federal guidelines issued, that different states have got different strategies and are at different phases in the whole situation we're in. There's way too many variables and unknowns at this point to talk about strategy and which ones are right and which ones are wrong and who got it right and who didn't get it right. There's even maybe an argument out there that the virus did what the virus was going to do all along, and maybe Sweden got it right after all. I said earlier on, I think this lockdown phase has got a limited lifespan, and and then we're going to return to whatever normal or the next normal is or the new normal is. And that timing, I believe, is going to be driven much more by the sentiment of the people. So that's why at Goldspring Consulting, we focused our efforts on surveying this sentiment, tracking that amongst our clients, reading some peer articles and peer surveys to determine, when the motivation to go back and travel is going to return.
Do you have a sense of timing?
The most we're seeing now is when we ask that question, when do you expect to travel to return? When are you expecting to travel return, like within 60 days, 90 days domestically? Is we're seeing the 60-day period quite low, but obviously the strongest category, we're out there maybe 90, 120 days before we start seeing that. So the domestic side, there are some signs that people are ready to travel again. But when we start looking at the international side, those numbers are much, much, much lower. So the much lower percentage of people willing to travel internationally, and also much lower percentage of people who are willing to attend large meetings or conferences. That's probably not going to happen until next year. The funny thing is, amongst all this, is that we do see a lot of people who are very willing to resume their personal and leisure travel. Right? But it seems it's when it's related with the business travel, the sentiment is much lower.
Is that the companies they're worried about duty of care liability issues?
So you always have to be careful with survey information as to how the question was asked and how it was interpreted by the people responding to the survey. So maybe we're saying, what is your sentiment? Are you willing to travel? But they're also conflating into that question, when is my company going to allow me to travel again? And that has probably tempered their responses, I would say. And so we have that difference between the personal and the business side. But I think on the personal side is, some people are just willing and ready to take that personal risk now, and they haven't seen family and friends in a long time. Grandparents, grandchildren, so who live in different states or different cities, and that they're willing to take that risk to resume travel. Which tells you something, that the business travel, when we're ready and the companies are ready, that the travelers should be ready as well.
I work for the Greater California Livery Association, but I homestead on a micro farm in the state of Washington. And a survey went out, and 78% of the respondents said they want to put their kids back in school. So I think, if I'm hearing you, it's when do we get to the point where staying at home and our businesses being furloughed is more of a risk than getting on with life outside of our four walls?
If you're asking what signs should we be looking at, what positive signs should would we be looking at, to see that the recovery is underway? And I said it is going to be driven by sentiment, and politicians of all stripes in either state are going to be in touch, taking the pulse of what their peoples want to do, and respond accordingly eventually, right? But I think we should be looking for really three things. And the first thing, you hit it right, which is the return for our schools and universities, particularly the schools and the young kids. We, like all societies, we love our children. And if we deem that it is safe for our children and young adults to return to the classroom, I think we'll eventually realize that, and realize that, whilst there are some risks to other people, but returning to schools is something that has to happen, right? And maybe, and also, the fact that we would be as a society willing to take that risk will be a key turning point. But on a practical note, it frees up the workforce to go back to work, right? If you've got kids at home, that's a big challenge for a lot of parents, and particularly when you've got two income earners in a house, to actually go back to work. Very, very tension on the reopening of schools, and I think that's why you've seen some narrative conversation, controversy on that subject. The second thing is, I think, is we all know we want to see when companies are going to allow their employees back into the workplace again, right? That's going to be a key element. We know there's going to be some longer term effects where some employees will stay, working remotely. But look for the companies returning to the workplace. We've seen some signs from some of the larger companies where that's not going to happen till Q1 next year, unfortunately. I think early on they decided we're just going to move this out and let everybody know. But more importantly, look for this particular little sign. Look for when companies allow visitors back into their workplace. Because it's one thing for travelers for workers to go back into the office. But if you can't accept visitors on site, then there's no point in traveling to meet you. So look for when companies, and I think those will be separate events, when companies allow external visitors from different sites in their own company, or suppliers and clients back into their office environments, right? And so that's the second point I'd watch out for. Watch out for the world of sports. Look for when we see, and I know you guys want to see that, look for when we see spectators returning to the venues again. That's going to be a very, very key indicator. If we're willing to go to sports venues, we're going to be willing to go to large conventions and meetings, which is what we all want to happen anyway. So I think those three things: return to schools and universities, return to the office environment, and letting visitors on site, and when we're allowed in sporting venues again. Those are three very, very public signs you can look for.
So you talk about the signs to look out for. Does this apply across the globe?
Well, as I said, I think everybody's on a different timeline, and I'm probably a little bit focused on the domestic side here. Everybody's on a different timeline with different approaches to the situations. But I think the three main points you can apply to most, if not all, countries. I've said that public sentiment is going to drive this thing, and different countries have different levels of control which they exercise over their people, and some may react faster or more conservatively to that public sentiment. I think when we look around individual countries around the world and their domestic programs, we will see the same thing going on depending on where they are in the timeline. But of course, the big question we want to ask ourselves is international travel. And international travel, we know that governments are going to be very, very defensive and very conservative as hotspots, COVID hotspots, will continue to emerge around the world, and they will be taking measures. And unfortunately, those measures will be in the form of banning travel from certain areas, regions, countries, cities, or restricting travel, or even imposing, quarantine measures from certain destinations. With all that going on and it being a moving target, that brings uncertainty into any proposition for an international trip. And nobody wants to be disrupted in a trip anyway, least of all in stranded in another country. So if you're planning or thinking you're going to travel internationally, you need to have a level of trust and confidence that you can get back home safely and on schedule. Particularly I've been in tune with the airlines. Yeah, the domestic, there's some optimistic, some conservative, but some moderate and good forecast for when travel returning towards the end of 2021 to something approaching the levels of pre-COVID. But for international travel, we may be looking as far out as 2024 before we see some of the international travel activity returning to the pre-COVID levels. One thing we haven't discussed is that there will be some permanent impacts on what has just happened. We have all just been locked down, we've been working, business has continued, but we have become far more proficient in the tools and the web meetings and delivering webinars such as we're doing now, without having to spend the travel. A lot of people have been working from home and maybe have found that they're just as efficient, maybe more efficient working from home than they were when they were traveling. As well, companies have not been unaffected, their top lines have not been unaffected by this, so budgets have been cut as well. The international ones are stronger, sort of higher budgets. So you put all that together, and unfortunately come up with the conclusion that that we're going to go back into this reaction where the value, the ROI on business travel will be questioned. Are there more efficient methodologies to achieve what you need to do? And if we go back to 2001, the tools that we had available then are not as efficient or as good as we have now. So business travel returned, despite all the other things that happened in that decade, did return relatively quickly. But I suspect that there will be a level of travel that will not resume as it was before. We'll have to wait for growth, just global growth, to catch back up.
Yeah, I seem to recall after 9/11, I remember the conversations parallel the conversations I'm hearing right now after 9/11. Travel was going to be forever altered. Video conferencing was going to replace face-to-face meetings, and it worked to a degree. And then human nature kicks in, the competitive spirit, the one sales guy that says, I'm going to go out and meet face-to-face with my client to unravel all of that and start the whole business travel craze again. I think that technology will impact the future, but I'm not sure we can stop being human beings. What do you see, if anything, happening in the balance of 2020?
First, it appears that a lot of suppliers and travel managers have kind of written off the rest of 2020, right? And the activities are very low. Look at the TMCs. The RFP season would be coming up. We'd be preparing for that, and that has been thrown into. Let's say there's big question marks over that. But the industry is searching for a new direction and a new way to do hotel RFPs, which is kind of exciting as well. So out of all this, there may be some positives that come along, but I see generally we see travel picking up as it goes along. It'll be fairly steady, but I think we'll really see the comeback and the numbers start to really improve in 2021. And again,
do you think we've seen the worst of things?
Yeah, I do believe that. I don't think that we'll be going back down to the lockdown protocols that we had in April and May time. I think it will be tempered to a certain extent, certain restrictions. And so I do think that overall we will be on a gradual slow uptick back to where we were. Of course, there's one thing we can always, when that magic pill comes along, that could be the game changer that we'll want. And we're hearing news reports all the time about vaccines. The other thing which could be a sign of hope, of course, is the herd immunity. And I follow the stats very, very closely. And there are a number of perhaps signs that herd immunity is much deeper into the population than we ever thought. And if that happens, and then the curve flattens even further naturally, and we're not locked down, then this thing may disappear. But those are very much unknowns at the moment.
Well, it's reassuring to hear you as an expert say that you see that the worst is over. And even if we're inching back to life, that's better than spiraling. What do you see companies needing to do?
So let's break that into two parts, right? This is where I think some private hire car mode, if we like, mode of transportation, would actually have an advantage in the future. So firstly, what can a supplier do within their particular area, within their particular category? The first thing they've got to do is make sure that they have communicated completely everything that they're doing for sanitation, hygiene, protocols, and everything to gain that trust from the individual travelers and the people who are managing the travelers, so that they get preferenced, right, within their direct competitors. But then look at the competitors in the ground transportation area who are slightly different. So let's look at public transportation. Let's look at rideshare. Let's look at taxis or even rental car. There are many, many points of contact and risk opportunities in those areas, particularly. Even personal vehicle. You drive a personal vehicle to an airport, you've got to get on a shuttle. You've got to take a trip. There's many more points of contact.
We can sell safety better. We have employed chauffeurs. We own our fleets. They come back to our garages. And so we have the means for those quality control issues better than the ride hail and better than the subways and public transportation.
You always have to make the best out of the situation, and I think there's an opportunity there for private hire car service to promote a safety and security angle over other forms of transportation in the mobility area. Is one, make sure you're communicating well so that you stand out amongst your direct competitors, but also sell the concept that private hire car is probably going to be a safer mode of transportation than perhaps some alternatives that are in the travel policy.
That's excellent. Our core clientele are the business travel managers. I'm a little concerned about the state of affairs with these trade organizations, the Association for Corporate Travel Managers filing bankruptcy and the leadership shakeup over at GBTA. What do you see in the way of the future for these associations in managed travel?
Well, Sarah, there is a huge amount to unpack there. So it's interesting, and the first question on these trade organizations is their identity and who they're representing and what their goals and objectives are. I think we saw, and as a buyer, and I've heard a lot of people say this, I really liked ACT, and I'm sad to see its demise. It was very, very educational and tended to serve up much more educational content. But we saw with GBTA, perhaps it was looking to change its identity a little bit, become a media organisation, be more prescriptive. Clearly, it was had voiced some opinions which were favouring some of the supplier lobby as well, which is questionable whether that was their place or not. So the first thing these trade organisations need to do is really define their mission and identity. And I think GBTA's had a bit of a reset. Got a great leader in place now who is known and loved throughout the community, and has got a great opportunity to reset itself and be a major player in the industry going forward. And I hope that identity is much more about bringing people together and serving up educational content and building relationships, which I believe is its main mandate. And then, of course, there are some other industry players out there as well. And even some of the media organisations get involved in educational content as well. So, these sad to see that ACT is no longer. We've seen BTN, for example, has acquired a trade show in London and was planning the trade show over here, which is now going to be virtual this year. So that's a media organisation moving much more into an association type identity. So it'll be interesting.
Well, that's good to know, because my constituents go to these events in the hopes of networking with the travel managers and suppliers. So they want to see these associations succeed, and they want to continue to have those venues to access their customer base.
It's very important that these associations succeed. It's very, very important that they have the correct identity, and it's very important that we do get a little bit of choice amongst them as well. That would be nice as well, and I believe that we will return to that. Whether ACT returns as ACT or in that form, I couldn't see or predict. But alternatives will be offered.
A parting shot. How about some hope and optimism towards the future?
Okay, so yes, we've been through some tough times. I think we're on the way out here. But I remember that phrase: "Necessity is the mother of invention." Right? I'm old enough to remember a little bit of the 70s, and in the US and the UK and most of the world, it wasn't seen as perhaps the best economy in the world. It was poor at best or stagnant. Yet out of the 70s were born the following companies: Microsoft, Southwest Airlines, Apple, Gentech, FedEx, Oracle. All those companies and many, many more were founded during perhaps one of the worst economies that we saw. Within a decade, those companies had either completely disrupted the industries that we're in, or created new markets, or dominated them. So we've gone through some tough times now. I wonder what the benefits we will be experiencing in 10 years of the companies that were born during the COVID era. Can't wait to find out.
Well, we'll also have a baby boom, so we'll have a lot more people moving around on the planet. Anyway, I want to thank you, Neil, for your time and your fantastic insights. On behalf of the Greater California Livery Association, we very much appreciate your guidance and your expertise.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah.
Take care. Stay well.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me along for the chat.